We'll just wait a few minutes for people to join. But whilst we're doing that, I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Laura Eshelby. And Laura is with the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and I hope she's going to tell us a little bit about the initiative behind the Public Sector Fraud Authority's establishment, and also to tell us a little bit about the work that is being done in relation to the COVID fraud issues. Thereafter, David Bacon, who is with Thompson Reuters, will address us on some of the recent developments in relation to the legislative framework for improving fraud. And then we've got Harry Adams, who's on the training side, and Chris also, who's joining us, who will be telling us about the current working group on disclosure. So without more ado, if you could make sure that your video is off and you're on mute if you're not one of the speakers, and then I'll hand over to Laura and I'll share screen so that you can see Laura's presentation. So.
Thanks very much. I'll just wait for the slides to come up there. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so I'll just introduce myself to start, and as was introduced, if people have questions and comments as I go through, if you pop them in the chat, we can pick those up at the end. So some of you might know me, some of you might not. So I'm Laura Eshelby, Deputy Director here at the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and I have been here in the Cabinet Office for around 10 years now, which has gone very quickly. Prior to that, I have worked I've worked in counter fraud actually for 20 of my 21 years career. Did 1 year in audit, didn't last very long in audit. I spent most of the time finding fraud, so I've been working in counter fraud ever since, in investigation, risk and intelligence roles, and for those past 10, as I said, working centrally here in the Cabinet Office and leading on various policy kind of transformation projects. One of those big ones for the past 5 years has been developing a dedicated counter fraud profession. I believe it's the first in the world of its kind, but happy to be challenged if someone else has found one. Yeah, I will focus in a little bit on that because that's my kind of core role. So if we start with the next slide, I was asked to say the green one, sorry, long before. Thanks, Tony. Before I start to talk about the Public Sector Fraud Authority, I want to kind of zoom back to 2020 and think about actually before the pandemic hit. I'm not sure if this is kind of fortune or luck, but we had our CEO at the time was on secondment to Australian Commonwealth Fraud Prevention Centre, who were kind of on a journey to develop a central response to fraud for the Australian government based in the Attorney General's office. And they had terrible issues with bushfires, which I'm sure is well documented. And so we worked with them and some of our international partners in Canada, New Zealand, and America as well, to produce, you can see an extract there of managing fraud in emergency situations. Everything I talk about today, by the way, you can find on Gov.uk. We publish all our documentation. So before the pandemic hit in the UK, we had been starting to think centrally in the counter fraud function in the UK about how can you manage fraud when emergencies hit. As I say, the bushfires in Australia were a really big motivator for us. We learned a great deal about that through the types of fraud that were targeted there. There was also Hurricane Katrina, and of course in London we had the Grenfell fires. All of those have a common denominator, that the government, local, central governments tried to deploy support and services as quickly as possible. But with that, obviously, comes huge risk because fraudsters and criminals are there ready to exploit. And that might sound cynical, but unfortunately, if you look at all of those examples, that is true. So prior to the pandemic, we had this insight that we'd already pulled together, and this is just an extract. There's a very comprehensive guidance that we pulled together. So the kind of key principles that we took when thinking about managing fraud And this is really interesting when you then look at what happened during COVID and what we learned. We said, first of all, you should accept there is a high risk of fraud. It's going to happen. So before the pandemic even hit, we'd published this and, said this is going to happen. Integrate fraud control resources into policy and process design. So if you look at all of the, again, well-documented National Audit Office reviews of the pandemic in the UK, but also if you look at the great work of the GAO and PRAC in the USA, this is something that is constantly talked about. This is one of the key things to think about. Thirdly, businesses and fraud control should work together where possible to introduce low friction countermeasures. And again, we have produced specific guidance around what those type of countermeasures can be and how when they can be deployed in different parts of the public sector. Carrying out post-event assurance. So this is something that is still ongoing now, even post-pandemic. But when it's not possible to put in controls and prevent fraud, for example, if money has to be pushed out at such a pace to get to the right people, it's not always possible to do work, pre-expenditure. So that's where post-event assurance becomes very, very relevant and helps you to understand lessons learned. It doesn't help you get the money back, but it helps you learn what went wrong, what the level was, and helps you to bake that into future response. And then the final one is really interesting, being mindful when you shift from that emergency payment into kind of business as usual, and thinking about not just dealing with the moment but also how you deal post-event and revisit your control framework. And that's something that's often missed. So I just wanted to set the scene, but before the pandemic, this is what we were thinking about. And if we move to the next one, please. So when we went through the pandemic for a few years, the public sector was targeted. So every time stimulus support was put out, it was targeted. Every time we had interventions kind of going on in parallel, such as COVID testing, COVID Pass. Remember COVID Pass was a thing for a while. Every time anything was announced, we would immediately see that being spoofed, used by criminals, smishing, phishing. All of those techniques were deployed at pace by criminals. There was very well documented in the media all the different types of fraud that occurred. We weren't alone in the UK, and I know from working closely during the pandemic with our international colleagues in the USA, they lost trillions of dollars, yes, and we lost, we think, between 10 and 15 billion, but to be honest, the counting is still ongoing, and we probably will not know for some time in some areas due to the nature of fraud, which I'm sure you're all aware, how much we've actually lost. Those lessons learned there really do mirror and complement, but kind of go a bit further, I guess, than the pre-pandemic thinking. So trusted expertise is critical. I always find it very interesting, and maybe it's something to debate afterwards, that you have to prove that you're a counter fraud expert to get your foot in the door, to have a conversation, to give advice. Many of you are from the legal field, and you don't have to prove your credentials before someone listens to you and takes your advice. So it's very interesting, and I'll come on to talk about the profession, how we're trying to build recognition. But that's one of those drivers, is because during the pandemic, people didn't readily accept the advice from experts, and we had to continually prove our case of who we were. I'm talking broadly as the function, before we could give our advice. Trusted structures, that's something that I'll come on to tell you how we're trying to remedy that, but that's obviously what's needed. And challenges for less mature organisations. So again, that's been well documented by the National Audit Office and others, but that was a real challenge. Some organisations were overnight having to give out rapid response and millions of hundreds of millions of pounds, and they didn't have the fraud response ready to back that up. Upfront fraud risk assessment. So again, that might sound pretty obvious to people who are kind of counter fraud professionals, but that wasn't embedded in a systemic way across government, and that led to a lot of unknowns in terms of what level of risk was there. Seeking resource and compliance up front, again, that was not something that was kind of baked into our existing structures, and hopefully when I come on to tell you about the solutions, part of the solution through the Public Sector Fraud Authority, you can see the correlation between the issues raised here and what we've done to bake into our new structure. Accountability and incentive structures are both really key issues. So where's the incentive to find fraud and to recover and take action? Where is that baked into upfront program design during a pandemic or as business as usual? And that's a key one to all be thinking about in the work we do. And having a can-do mindset. So that might sound, somewhat flippant, but I think that was really something that we noticed in many different challenges during COVID was missing. So if we move on. So I wanted to kind of set the scene with COVID and what we learned, and I'm happy to, explore that further. But as I come on to talk about the Public Sector Fraud Authority, I wanted to kind of bring you back to modern day and what we're seeing. So I took a look at the recent annual crime survey, and actually overall fraud offences, this includes beyond public sector, so the broader UK response, also shows that 3.3 million fraud offences. So that has actually gone down. However, fraud still does remain the most prevalent crime in the UK overall, and makes up for about 40% of the overall crime type. And the scale of the challenge there, just to set the scene, this is just for the public sector, including tax and welfare. We estimate that the minimum we lose every year is £33 billion. And as I say, with COVID, that will go up even further, and those figures will continue to increase. What do we have in place already? So I represent the public sector, and we have over 13,000 people, most of those in tax and welfare, ready to respond and tackle fraud. And then there's additional resources via the Home Office, who provide the response for fraud against PLC, UK PLC and the public. So that's how kind of the portfolio is divided. They also oversee the funding and for policing response. We move on. So I wanted to set the scene before I told you a little about the Public Sector Fraud Authority. So we were launched last summer. And what's the difference between, the central team that's been in the Cabinet Office for some time? So the big shift is to have a greater focus on performance and outcomes. So moving away from just collecting data and keeping score, which I think was kind of synonymous with the centre for some years. How do we do that? By having an increased depth and breadth of support. So I'll come on to show you in a second some of the services and function areas that we are introducing. And then a key one is not just so we operate from jointly the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, and report jointly to both ministers within the Cabinet Office and Treasury. Although if you're watching the news, that does change quite a lot. PSFA mission. So I won't go through all of this line by line, but just to give you a little insight there, these are the kind of things that we want to do to bring that kind of overall mandate to life, to modernise the fraud response through the innovation and technology. So we have a whole team dedicated to innovating in data analytics, network analytics. We're doing a lot with industry partners at the moment. Building expert services, I'll come on to talk about. Building capability through the profession. Again, I'll come and talk about that. Putting performance at the heart of the conversation. So this is around, I said there was 13,000 people working in public sector fraud. It's well documented through tax and welfare, what they do every single year. They have annual reporting. But we have now taken on additional work to focus on what the rest of government is doing for that return on investment, where there is investment in staff focused on fraud. And then lastly, an ambition to be seen as the kind of beacon of fraud and error expertise and a destination, hopefully, for people that want to build a career. And we currently have around 150 people now in this central unit. So we've grown from like 30 to 150 over the past year. So if we move on, just to give you the kind of structure of the organisation, that's often a question we get. How is it made up? And you can see we're split into service and function areas. Data and intelligence is an existing area that we have within the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and that is already doing lots of great work with the National Crime Agency, Companies House, and others to innovate in how we can use data to seek out organised crime groups and to prevent where possible. Enforcement is a really interesting one, particularly for the kind of people on this call today, and that is something that we are at the moment designing and seeking to introduce, and that will be enforcement resources for those people outside of tax and welfare who don't have, their own investigation or recovery services. We're working hard to make sure we can put in more provisions for those people who lack the capacity to be able to scale up their own enforcement. Risk, threat and prevention. So you remember a key lesson learned from COVID was how can we get up front in scheme and project design the consideration of fraud risk. So we now have a little army of 20 people who can be deployed across government to do just that. I won't go through all of the function areas. I'm going to major really on capability if we move on. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, well, how will the public sector fraud authorities show that it's having an impact? How will we know as stakeholders and interested parties across different sectors that you're doing what you say you'll do? So we had around £24 million investment over 3 years from Treasury. And a big part of that business case was taking the lessons learned from COVID and showing that there were capability and capacity gaps across government in those areas like risk and data that I mentioned. We publish, and you can see it on Gov.uk right now, the different streams that we have, and all of our objectives as an organisation are specified underneath of those. The big thing to note is that we do have a financial target, and it's an audited target, to achieve over £185 million in our first full year of outcomes. That is predominantly through data analytic and tactical work in that space, because the other services are still building. But in the future, there may be further outcomes financially from them as well. If we move on. I was asked to include a little bit as well, just about how do we report and how do we classify fraud in the public sector? Again, I won't read all of this out. I wanted to leave time to talk about the profession. But it's just to flag, we do use the Fraud Act, but the reporting internally for reporting and recording purposes is using a civil balance test. So that doesn't mean that people can't take criminal action when fraud is found, but at first blush, when it's reported through to us, that's the balance that we ask for them to report it through to us, and whether it's kind of then taken on in a criminal sense is for a decision for departments. And again, for transparency, you can see all of the data every year back to 2019, I believe, by department. In terms of the level of fraud detected, prevented and recovered. So if you're joining from a government department, you can look on and see, or you might have a particular interest in government departments and how they're doing, and you can start to correlate where there are resources and capacity and where they are finding and making a difference in terms of fraud. So that's something that we do as well. If we move on, well, what are the types of fraud? We have exactly the same types of fraud in the public sector that they have in across all sectors. So whether it's misrepresentation or false declarations, whatever it is, we have that as well. And these are the types of areas that government departments are asked to report against, and that's where people target us the most. So pre, post, during procurement, grants is a really growing space. And then for internal fraud, you can see a range of different things, which I don't think will be novel to anyone on the call today. If we move on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about insider fraud as well, because we do have some particular initiatives that some of you might have heard me talk about, because I introduced this back in 2015. But we had a particular issue in the public sector around people committing what were allegations of fraud offences, but were leaving without the investigations being completed and kind of circulating around the public sector. We're not alone with this issue, and I know that CIFAS do a lot with industry with their own internal fraud hub, so this is quite a similar approach. What we did, though, is worked with the Ministry of Justice to look at the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act to introduce an additional sanction. So if you commit fraud, you'll be dismissed, but you'll also have an additional sanction that your data will go onto a hub, and then you'll be used for pre-employment checks, and you'll be banned for an additional 5 years from re-employment as a kind of additional sanction. So happy to take any questions on that a bit later. But it's quite a novel kind of approach that we've taken. Again, don't know many other countries that have taken this approach with their governments, and I have spoken to a few. Just to conclude, if I move on, Tony, I just wanted to say a little bit about the government counter-fraud profession. So if you remember back to the beginning of my introductory talk, to tell you a little bit about the Public Sector Fraud Authority, a key driver was that, during COVID, we saw that risk wasn't considered up front. There wasn't a strong expert voice, or that certainly wasn't viewed across government. And there was a real lack of capability and capacity, particularly in areas beyond investigation. So during a pandemic or post-pandemic, when we're introducing large expenditure or change in government, what we need is people to be able to evaluate the risk of fraud upfront in programs. We need people post-program implementation or post-procurement to be able to conduct post-event assurance and to be able to advise on countermeasures, which are low friction and have a big impact. All of those skills are not in investigation. These are new or emerging skills and career pathways that we want to develop. So one of the ways that we do that is through the government counter-fraud profession. And again, our strategy is on Gov.uk, so you can see more there. But I just wanted to touch on the kind of things that we're doing and who is part of this government counter-fraud profession. So we have around 7,000 members from 65 organisations, central government, local government, and also some policing units, which Harry and Chris represent one of those wider organisations here today as well. And these are the 5 areas that we're going to focus on for the profession for the next couple of years. So if any of these are of interest to people, do get in touch with me afterwards as well, because we do work across all different sectors to build this profession. The first one is around building deep counter-fraud capability. And that means about building these career pathways beyond investigation. So we have a lot of standards and support for people in investigation, but we also want to build a new generation of fraud fighters in areas like prevention, risk and measurement. Developing our members, so providing technical events, CPD, and we have a digital online community of practice. Leadership, so we've recently developed a bespoke leadership programme for the senior civil servants who lead counter-fraud functions in government. Diversity and inclusion. So every strategy should have a workforce element. Some of the statistics that we have from our latest membership survey are quite shocking. The current profession membership shows us that 64% of members in fraud, working in fraud, are over 50. Only 10% are non-white, and only 38% are female. So we have a lot of work to do to build a profession that is truly representative of the public we serve. And the last one is to amplify and promote and build awareness of the counter-fraud profession. So that obviously brings us to events like today. So just to round up there, the last bit, please, Tony. Just to conclude, the Public Sector Fraud Authority has been introduced to bring greater focus on performance and outcomes. So it's more than keeping score. It's not just about collecting data and presenting that back. It's a big part of our job to publish how people are performing and the return on investment that we can see across government where there is investment. We're building services in risk, intelligence, data analytics to bolster the existing expertise across government and to offer tactical support, to strengthen resilience and build structures such as building capability through the profession so we can manage the existing threat, but also prepare for the future. And critical to all of this is to retain experts and build routes to build talent, as I said, beyond just investigation into new career pathways such as risk, prevention, and in the future, data analytics. So I think I've taken more time than I was allowed, so apologies. But thanks very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions about any of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn over to David Bacon from Thomson Reuters, who's going to give us a short overview of some of the new legislative measures and some of the reports, I believe, as well, David. Is that correct?
That's correct. So thank you very much, Tony, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this meeting today. Just while Tony's getting the slides up, I'm a senior editor at Thomson Reuters, writing about business crime and similar materials for various law firms, companies. I'm also a board member at the Fraud Advisory Panel, so do quite a lot of work and commenting on legislation and consultations. So really, we've got to put in both caps there. I'm just going to try and move this off the slide. That should be better. Perfect. Then we'll begin. So the first development, slide 2, for next year is the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. I'm not going to go into great detail because I'm sure you're all familiar with this particular piece of legislation, but it's one that seems to have been around forever. It kept on getting knocked back. It had a tricky situation between the House of Lords and Commons, but eventually received royal assent last month, 26th of October. And I think it really brought in perhaps 3 key changes, none of which are enforced yet, but should come into force in 2024. The first is, and I put finally, because we seem to have been discussing it for about a decade, the introduction of failure to prevent fraud offence, similar to Bribery Act that we're all now pretty familiar with, which imposes criminal liability on a large organisation that fails to prevent fraud. One of the issues was whether it should be fraud intended to benefit the organisation or against the organisation more generally, and they settled on at this stage to benefit the organisation. And again, they have an adequate procedures defence in place, which we're still waiting for the guidance for that, but will almost certainly mirror that of the Bribery Act, being based on those 6 principles. 2 comments about this legislation. First of all, it's limited to large organisations at present, and they're using the Companies Act definition. That is organisations with 2 out of 3 of the following criteria: more than 250 employees, more than 36 million turnover, and more than 18 million in total assets. So it's quite limited legislation at present. There is, however, the ability to change that and make it apply to smaller companies. If we go to the next slide, two, I think, certainly in the short to medium term, more significant changes are dealt with on the 3rd page, which is a change to corporate criminal liability and reforms to Companies House. Corporate criminal liability has always been a problem for many organisations, particularly the Serious Fraud Office, when dealing with very big, complex cases. It really came to a head in the Barclays failed prosecution a couple of years ago. And that's led to this change that expands the class of persons whose conduct can be attributed to the company. And in the legislation, an organisation will be guilty of offence where a senior manager acting within the actual or apparent scope of their authority commits the relevant offence. The main change there is to avoid the Barclays type defence, which is what was within their knowledge and similar, that makes it far more difficult to prosecute big, complex structures than it did, say, smaller cases. From my time at the Serious Fraud Office, I was involved in one of the smaller companies prosecuted, a printing firm called Smith & Usman, based on the South Coast. And that was obviously quite straightforward because there were 3 directors, and you trace you could interview them all quite easily, find out what happened, and then bring charges. It's completely different when you're dealing with a huge company. This will certainly be, I think, one to watch. Perhaps the biggest change, and this is the one that seems to have been overlooked by a lot of people talking about this, is the reforms to Companies House, which, as far as I can see, are enormous. I think there are two things I'd like to concentrate on. First of all, what they actually do is create new identity verification requirements for company directors, people with significant control, and those delivering documents to the registrar, but also increasing the investigation and enforcement powers for the registrar, including new offences under the Companies Act. And it's interesting hearing it's talking about the public sector fraud department. That's a very, very, very welcome development. But one of the big problems I find with government organisations is, how do you actually get people in to do the work, the appropriate skills at the investigation, and also stop them leaving for the private sector where salaries are often higher? It's really good to hear some great initiatives about that will happen. But I should just caution you as well that not only are the public sector fraud authority looking for new staff, new people to join and develop their careers there, if Companies House is going to go from being a sort of post box of information to an actual regulator with investigation powers, supervision powers, enforcement powers, they're going to need an awful lot of investigation, legal and regulatory staff. And it's obviously competing in the same pool as public sector fraud for that. So there's going to have to be, I think, some thoughts about how much money various government departments are going to be given and salaries going forward. So I'll come to a bit later. There's another team who may also want a share of those resources. So if we move to the next slide, this is really the timescale stuff, but the publication of the guidance on the adequate procedures defence is expected early 2024. I'd be very surprised if it was greatly different to the Bribery Act guidance, though I think we certainly hope it'll be more concise and precise. I mean, a 60-page document with multiple examples, I don't think was the most helpful way with the Bribery Act. Again, it requires companies. Sorry, can you go back, Tony? A second. Sorry, thanks, Tony. And we got that. And again, companies will be required to engage in the various ID requirements. The enforced date of that will come in by various statutory instruments coming forward. And we will hopefully get some guidance from Companies House on their supervision and enforcement policies prior to all the requirements becoming in force. It's anticipated that everything in the Act will be in force in 2024. The only things that we know for definite now are a few minor changes to POCA from the money laundering perspective, which come into force straight away, and the corporate criminal liability changes come into force rather bizarrely on Boxing Day. Not quite sure why they had a 2 month from the date of the Act going into force, but they put that in place, and it is Boxing Day. So that's a sort of whistle stop of what's happening on the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. But there's other legislation coming in next year as well. The Procurement Act 2023, which received royal assent on the same day as the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, didn't quite have the same fanfare, but certainly some people have suggested it could be a rather more potent tool for those fighting fraud. And you'll forgive me, as procurement itself is not my speciality. So there's quite a lot about procedures working and similar. But most importantly, there is a framework for excluding suppliers from seeking government contracts. Used to be something that could be put in for companies in terms of DPAs and similar. but there's now an actual legal framework for that, including a central debarment list. And the key areas for this legislation are Schedule 6 and Schedule 7. Schedule 6 sets a mandatory exclusion, and note the word mandatory, to a supplier if a connected person to it, they're a connected person, has been convicted of an offence referred to in the schedule. And that offences include fraud, theft, bribery, money laundering, and pretty much every business crime kind of offence. So having when it comes to force, when you do have the power to automatically exclude a company from government contracts with a conviction, that's quite strong. What makes it even stronger is the ability to exclude on discretionary grounds for conduct that doesn't result in conviction or necessarily proven criminal behaviour, but the sort of behaviour that might lead to a investigation, regulatory action, or even simply bad conduct. That's all set out in Schedule 7, and potentially very, very potent weapon against companies that are bidding for government contracts. So it could be used in, say, construction, some of the big service companies, and similar. It's also worth bearing in mind in Schedule 6, there's a extraterritorial jurisdiction matter put into it, which enables an offence committed in another country or territory outside the UK to result in mandatory exclusion if the conduct constituting that offence was carried out in a part of the UK. So essentially the new updated term used in the Money Laundering Act comes into the Procurement Act. Sorry, the POCA comes into the Procurement Act. Okay, next slide, please. Online Safety Act, I'm only touching on this very, very generally because it's not necessarily fraud, but again, it's a enormous piece of legislation that's been taken a while to come into force and creates additional demands on another government department, Ofcom, and requires them to, gives them the ability to issue fines, quite significant ones too, and conduct investigations. We will no doubt wait for their codes and guidance in the early part of next year, and the timetable for various parts of that coming in, which will be brought in by SIs. But one of the themes I'm going to make quite a bit in this talk is there's a lot of bodies here competing for resources, for investigators, and unless there are clear financial commitments to that, maybe some problems in delivering what people may expect. We go to the next slide. There's a review of fraud and disclosure over the next 18 months. I know others in the chat will go into this in more detail, but I really just want to have a very quick look at the what is planned. And on 12th of October 2023, Home Office announced this review. Worth bearing in mind, the last independent review of fraud was in 1986, which led to the creation of the SFO. And since then, the nature of fraud has changed massively. Now constitutes over 40% of all offences in England and Wales. There's a huge growth in online-enabled fraud, none of which was in contemplation of people in 1986. So I certainly think it's long overdue, and it'll be very interesting to see where things go. The review is going to be chaired by Jonathan Fisher, KC of Redline Chambers, and it's going to be split into two parts. One to look at the disclosure regime and one to look at fraud more generally. What we know about the reports so far, go to the next slide, please, Tony, is that the disclosure regime is going first, and that's due to report in summer 2024. Summer 2024 sometimes can be quite a vague thing. Could be any time from June to well into September, and I think it'll probably be in September rather than the early part. But that's really going to look at current disclosure regime set out in the CPIA and focus on the applications for cases with a large amount of digital material, as well as the AG's guidelines on disclosure. Disclosure for many of us has been an absolute issue for as long as we can remember. My only comment on it is that the kind of discussions that many people have been having really, in my view, are now redundant anyway. We're still hearing news of keys to the warehouse and similar when the warehouse simply doesn't exist anymore. It's a computer server containing more information than one person can look through in their lifetime. So hopefully it'll be a real deep branch reconsideration. And in my view, the best thing to do will be to take away the responsibility for disclosure from the prosecution in its entirety. In my view, it very much should be a shared thing between prosecution and defence lawyers, and require more active participation in that side. I would say that as a prosecutor, but I've sat in the other camp as well. So, and that seems to me the best way to ensure disclosure happens accurately. And this is going to be followed on. Sorry, Tony, you've jumped ahead of me slightly there, but it's going to be followed on from that with a review of the fraud offences, and that's at the moment described to explore if certain fraud offences should be summary only rather than triable either way. I'm not sure it's going to make a huge difference, and it's looking at perhaps pushing some very minor offences through the magistrates' court. Not sure that's going to work without considerable funding on magistrates' courts, which are already suffering from too high a workload. And it's also going to look at further procedures for informing and looking at perhaps civil powers. What we don't know is whether it will look at whether the Serious Fraud Office is suitable for dealing with the bigger frauds, where it needs to be reintegrated. That argument comes around all the time, whether we need to have a much greater concentration of fraud teams within police forces and similar. But we'll see what comes out of that. No doubt there'll be consultations launched over the next few months or so. And talking of the Serious Fraud Office, next slide, please, Tony. Worth bearing in mind, as I call it, new sheriffs in town. We have relatively new departments set up. We have existing departments becoming regulators and investigators. And we also have changes at the head of our prosecution and prosecution agencies. Stephen Parkinson, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, became DPP, succeeding Max Hill at the beginning of this month. Certainly, I think an excellent choice and somebody who will do a fantastic job as DPP. We'll see what changes are made and whether or not there'll be a great concentration on fraud. And Nick Grave became director on the 25th of September, taking over from Lisa Osofsky. Very interesting appointment. Previously a very, very high profile police officer with Surrey Police and Assistant Commissioner of the Met, but obviously a different tactic from previous appointments. I think the first non-lawyer to be in charge of the Serious Fraud Office. And the direction he will take could be quite interesting. Whenever you get a new director of the Serious Fraud Office, I've served under 3 and really followed another 3 or 4 at various stages of my career. You tend to get a bit of a change of direction that becomes clear after a few months. And his first 2 big decisions perhaps start to give a bit of an indication of where things might go. But there was the opening of a investigation into suspected fraud at a prepaid funeral plans company, very much an investment type fraud, and also the arrest and searches earlier this week in relation to the Acronym law firm, which has had a lot of discussion with various regulators and a lot of intervention going on there. So whether that indicates perhaps a more proactive approach from the Serious Fraud Office, perhaps less focus on corporate entities and more focus on individuals, we'll see. But it's very much early days yet. Just a couple of matters in brief on the next slide. There's draft legislation for a finance bill published to create new strict liability offences for certain tax matters that should come into force later in 2024. The King's speech earlier this month, proposed 3 additional bills, most of which were, I suppose you call it the kind of bill that you might bring in anticipation of an election in the next 12 months. Lots of talk about tougher sentences, increasing the confidence of victims and empowering police forces. The substance of those legislation, I'm not sure is going to make a huge difference to fraud and business crime, but we'll see how things work out when they get through the various discussion stages in the Commons. The final thing I think is going to be a really conceptual theme for fraud and law enforcement over the next probably going to be a 10-year project, but it seems to be coming to the forefront now, is artificial intelligence. And that's a word we're all familiar with, but how it can be used in fraud, to what extent can people's voices, people's identities be manipulated, to what extent can you rely on evidence if you have the ability to manipulate images, CCTV, similar, quite easily, and its integrity into things as simple as education. I did a speech on that at the Cambridge Symposium earlier this year. Can you have reliable essays submitted when AI is in use, and to what extent should misuse of it be civil or criminal? So I think that's going to be a conceptual issue that certain bodies will have to be aware of and looking at going forward.
I think we're going to have to end this session. Thank you very much to our speakers for participating. It's been really interesting to hear some of the initiatives that have been going on with respect to public sector fraud, and also to hear of the training initiatives within that sector, and the move towards more joined up government in a way, and more sharing of information and resources. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating, and I'll wish you a good night.